Hey there. Tonight I want to begin with a small piece of clay, no wider than a human hand, sleeping for centuries in a museum drawer, while the room around it stayed cool, dry, and quiet. A scholar lifts it under a pale light, turns it slightly, and notices a line that should not be there. Not a prayer for harvest. Not a king praising his own bricks. Not a merchant counting sheep and barley. A line about the Anunnaki making war on the Anunnaki. And suddenly, the whole old world feels less like a legend and more like a memory that somebody tried very hard not to lose. Before we go any further, if you enjoy these slow, strange journeys into the oldest shadows of history, leave a like and subscribe. It helps preserve these stories, which feels fitting tonight, because ancient scribes and modern listeners are not so different. We both worry that important things might vanish if nobody keeps repeating them. Now let the room grow a little dimmer. Let your jaw soften. Let your shoulders drop. Take one slow breath in and another one out. Imagine cool archive air on your skin, the faint mineral smell of old clay, the hush of a museum corridor after closing time, and the soft sense that thousands of years are leaning very close. The fragment was small, damaged, almost modest. That is what makes it unsettling. Great mysteries do not always arrive wearing a crown. Sometimes they arrive chipped at the corners, half broken, with only a handful of lines still alive. Yet those lines whisper of fire from heaven, of land poisoned for 3 harvests, of a city where birds did not sing for 40 years. If you were standing here with me, with that tablet under the lamp, I think you would feel the same little chill I do. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation of hearing a locked door move on its hinges in the next room. And this is where the story really begins. Not with certainty, but with a pattern. Because that fragment is not alone. Across museums, across shelves, across photographs taken long ago and filed away with the patient sadness of unfinished work, other texts wait. A line in Nineveh, a phrase in Philadelphia, a broken section in Paris, a lament in Baghdad. When you place them beside one another, carefully, the way a restorer places loose pieces around a cracked vessel, a shape begins to form. Conflicts among gods, councils divided, cities abandoned, territories disputed, weapons, or storms, or divine forces that left the ground barren and the water bitter. Then, around 2,000 years before the Common Era, devastation so severe that the old Sumerian world never truly returned in the same way. Some scholars would say this is mythology, and that may be true in part. It is debated, as so much is when the evidence is ancient and the voices are damaged. Still, I have always found it strange that these texts so often sound less like songs made for entertainment and more like records written by tired officials who wished the world would stop collapsing long enough for them to sharpen a stylus. They name cities. They count rains. They describe canals, temples, gates, walls, harvests, storage, smoke, drought, and movement. Their gods are not airy abstractions floating in moral lessons. Their gods eat, command, argue, punish, travel, hold territories, and seem in an oddly human way, to resent one another. To understand why that matters, we need to walk south, very far south, into the old marshes of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates slide toward the Persian Gulf. The land there is hot and flat and low, mud underfoot, reeds whispering in wind, water channels catching the last light of evening. If you arrived with modern eyes and no map of history, you might not choose it as the birthplace of the first cities. There is little stone, little timber. Metal must come from elsewhere. The floods can nourish, but they can also ruin. The ground itself feels temporary in places, as if it has not fully decided whether to be river or land. And yet here, in this awkward, shimmering plain, something astonishing happened. Villages became cities. Cities gained walls, storage systems, temple compounds, labor forces, irrigation networks, and an administration clever enough to count grain, track workers, and remember debts. By around 3200 BCE, writing appears in a form far beyond a few scratched pictures. Not just marks to say there were sheep once. Not just symbols to say barley came in and barley went out. A real script, able to carry grammar, poetry, orders, names, complaints, offerings, and memory itself. That leap has always troubled neat stories about slow progress. Mainstream history, sensibly enough, points to agricultural surplus, specialization, population growth, and administrative pressure. Once people farm enough land, the argument goes, complexity follows. True enough, perhaps. But the Sumerians themselves told a different story. They said they were taught. This is where the Anunnaki step softly into the lamplight. The word appears again and again across the literature of Mesopotamia. The translations vary a little. Offspring of Anu, those of princely seed, those who from heaven to earth came. However you prefer to phrase it, the idea remains the same. These were not treated merely as abstract qualities. They were powerful beings attached to cities, decisions, duties, and places. They governed. They resided. They required service. They had ranks and relations, and sometimes, judging by the texts, very poor tempers. One of the oldest cities, Eridu, was linked to Enki, lord of fresh water, wisdom, cleverness, hidden depths, and the sweet underground waters beneath the earth. Nippur belonged to Enlil, master of storms, command, decree, agriculture, and authority that felt more rigid, more vertical, more final. Belonged to Nana, the moon god, cool and measured, watching over calendars and tides of time. Uruk stood under Inanna, brilliant and dangerous, radiant with desire, conflict, ambition, and that intoxicating kind of grandeur that usually means somebody nearby is about to make a terrible decision with excellent posture. Each city had its divine patron, and the relationship was intimate in a way modern religion rarely feels. The god did not merely bless from afar. The god dwelled there, or so the texts suggest. The temple was a house as much as a shrine. It had staff, food, storerooms, fields, workshops, accountants, singers, brewers, shepherds, and scribes. The city served the god. The god protected the city. At least that was the ideal. Ideals, as you know, tend to look smoother from a distance. If you stand still long enough in this early world, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Anunnaki are not described as a calm, united family. They are arranged like a political structure. At the top sits Anu, distant sky father, king in a high formal sense, though not always the one doing the daily work of rule. Below him, the real strain appears. Enlil, authority, decree, to command. Enki, wisdom, adjustment, workaround, subtlety. Around them, many others with roles and regions and sacred cities of their own. A hierarchy, yes, but also a network. And networks fray. Honestly, that may be the quiet heart of the whole mystery. These old texts do not feel as though they are preserving a universe governed by perfect agreement. They feel as though they remember administration under pressure. One God responsible for one domain, another for another. The underworld somewhere below with its own laws. The surface world above. Heaven above that. Cities dependent on canals. Canals dependent on labor. Labor dependent on peace. Peace dependent on authority. Authority dependent on beings who increasingly sound as if they are not fully aligned. Even the earliest cities seem to hold this tension in their foundations. Excavation after excavation shows temple platforms rebuilt over older temple platforms, each generation laying new sacred architecture directly on the bones of what came before. Eridu is a good example. Layer after layer, mud brick above mud brick, shrine over shrine. The site itself feels like accumulated insistence. We were here. We built here. We served something here. We were not starting from nothing each time. We were inheriting instructions. That word matters. Instructions. Because so many of the texts read like instructions. Measurements, offerings, procedures, sequences, timings. There is a practical mood in them that can be strangely unnerving. They do not always gasp over miracles. They list them. They do not always romanticize kingship. They track it. They do not always frame catastrophe as poetic mystery. They record where people fled, which gates fell first, which god departed, which field stopped yielding grain. It is all so matter-of-fact that the impossible parts become harder to dismiss casually. Imagine a scribe in a dim room, clay damp beneath his palm, lamp smoke faint above him. Outside, maybe canal water slipping past brick embankments. Somewhere a dog, somewhere a donkey shaking its harness. Somewhere the distant mutter of a temple courtyard settling into evening. He presses wedge after wedge into the tablet. He is not writing for us. He is writing because the city needs the fact remembered. That mood, that dry, deliberate habit of recording, may be why these stories continue to haunt. They do not arrive dressed like fairy tales. They arrive dressed like administration. And so we return, gently, to the central question. If the Anunnaki were only literary symbols, why do the records preserve such persistent patterns of jurisdiction, rivalry, succession, and collapse? If they were only gods in the soft, distant way we often use the word today, why do they behave so much like rulers whose decisions have logistical consequences? And if they were neither mere metaphor nor simple theology, then what exactly were the Sumerians trying to tell later generations about the beings who stood at the beginning of their world? For now, we do not need to answer too quickly. Quick answers are usually the least restful companions at night. Better to let the old clay speak in its own pace. We have already found the first strange fragment. We have already walked the damp edges of the first cities. We have already met the beings the Sumerians claimed taught them how to build, govern, write, count, irrigate, and serve. The air is still, but not peaceful. Beneath these temple floors and quiet museum drawers, there is already a pressure building, something administrative and cosmic at once. Because once kingship has descended from heaven, someone must keep track of who received it, how long they held it, and what happened when the first age ended in water. That is where the old king list waits, patient as dried mud, ready to tell us that the world before the flood was not merely older than ours. It may have been governed by something larger, stranger, and far less stable than the stories told in daylight. And there is one more feeling that belongs here. A quiet feeling, but a real one. The feeling that these cities were built under supervision. Not in the crude sense that a foreman shouted from a wall, though perhaps that happened too. I mean in the deeper way, in the sense that the earliest Sumerian world seems to believe knowledge was handed down in packets, measured out, assigned, guarded. Agriculture to one city, judgment to another, sacred craft to another. The temples do not merely store grain and incense. They seem to store authorized ways of being. You live here. Therefore, you serve this power. Therefore, you inherit this order. That might sound almost comforting until you look more closely. Ordered worlds can be very beautiful. They can also be very brittle. A canal is beautiful, right until the water stops moving. A temple is beautiful, right until the god attached to it grows silent. A city under divine management is beautiful, right until the managers disagree. So let us sit with that for one moment longer. The reeds outside whisper. The clay dries. Somewhere in the dark old south, a scribe lifts his hand and studies what he has written. Perhaps he feels proud. Perhaps tired. Perhaps neither. He may not know that thousands of years later, strangers will stare at the same marks and wonder whether he was recording theology, memory, or the exhausted paperwork of a world already leaning toward disaster. But he writes anyway. That is the most human thing in this entire story. Before anyone runs, before anyone drowns, before any city goes silent, someone writes it down. The king list begins with a sentence so calm that it almost slips past you. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The first time I read it slowly, I had to stop and go back. Not because the line is complicated, because it is not. It is too plain. It offers no ceremony, No decorative fog, no dramatic trumpet. Kingship came down from heaven, and then it was somewhere specific. A city, a place on earth, a name you can point to on a map. That dry simplicity continues through the entries that follow. City, king, reign. Then another city, another king. The problem, of course, is the scale. The reigns before the flood are impossibly long. Tens of thousands of years. Numbers so enormous that a modern mind instinctively reaches for distance and safety. Symbolism, we say. Mythic arithmetic. Scribal play. Ritual exaggeration. And perhaps that is right. We cannot be sure. But what interests me most is not the numbers themselves. It is the tone in which they are given. The text does not sound like a poet trying to dazzle. It sounds like a clerk trying to remember accurately. One king ruled for 28800 years. Another for 36000. Another for 43200. The list does not blush. It does not explain. It just keeps going. The way a river keeps going when it passes from shade into sun. Then comes the break. Then the flood swept over. There it is again. That cold little sentence, neat as a blade. The world before. The world after. No lector. No moral. Just a divider so final that even now it has the stillness of a sealed gate. After the flood, kingship is lowered from heaven again. Not continued. Not politely resumed. But lowered again. As if a previous arrangement had ended and a new one had to be installed. This time the reigns shrink. Some are still unusually long by our standards. Yes, a few centuries here, a few centuries there. But the old impossible spans are gone. The world has contracted. Its rulers feel nearer to mortality, nearer to ordinary history, nearer to us. That change matters more than the numbers themselves. Something in the structure of rule has altered, and the list, stubborn and unromantic, refuses to tell us why. You know that feeling when someone in a family skips the most painful part of a story and moves directly to what happened afterward? It is a little like that. The text gives us the before and after, but not the trembling middle. So other tablets must do that work for us. Other fragments, other compositions, other arguments pressed into clay by hands long gone. Before we follow them, linger for a moment in the strange dignity of that list. Imagine the prism in the hand, edges worn, signs carefully set down. Imagine reading the names by lamplight in a scribal room where dust hangs above the floor and the night outside is warm and silent. Imagine the student copying line after line from an older exemplar while his teacher watches for mistakes. He may not believe every number in the way we use the word believe. That may not even be the point. He is preserving a chain, a sequence, a memory of how authority moved through the oldest age of all. And authority, in the Sumerian world, is never just symbolic. It has a house. It has a city. It has fields attached to it, labor attached to it, ritual attached to it. That is why the phrase kingship descended from heaven is more unsettling than it first appears. If you say rain descended from heaven, no one is surprised. If you say kingship descended from heaven, then you are saying government itself was installed, given, authorized, perhaps even delivered by beings who considered themselves the source rather than the ornament of order. This is where the old divine hierarchy begins to sharpen. At the highest distance sits Anu, the Sky Father, elevated, formal, darkened, almost remote. Beneath him, actual pressure gathers. Enlil, Lord of Command, storms, authority, decree. Engi, Lord of Wisdom, fresh water, craft, cunning, and the sweet underworld reservoirs that make agriculture possible in the first place. Around them stand many others, but these two matter especially, because the more closely you read the literature, the less they resemble partners in serene cosmic teamwork, and the more they resemble powerful administrators with very different instincts. Enlil feels like law spoken from a height. Enki feels like a side door found in the back wall when law becomes too rigid to breathe. That contrast appears again and again. One prefers order, formal decision, with command. The other prefers adjustment, problem solving, hidden roots, rescue through indirection. If this sounds almost political, that is because the texts often sound political. Not in the modern partisan sense, in the older sense, where everything depends on who has jurisdiction, who grants labor, who controls water, who decides punishment, who can override whom, and who dares to defy the council without saying the word defy aloud. We begin to see this more clearly in the old flood material. The story does not start, as later retellings often do, with a morally wicked humanity that deserves punishment for wickedness. It begins more strangely, and frankly more bureaucratically. Humanity has become noisy, too numerous, too active, too loud in the ears of the gods. The Akkadian versions use a word for noise, clamor, racket. It is such a mundane complaint that it almost feels funny at first. Imagine a civilization threatened because the upstairs neighbors will not stop existing. But beneath the faint absurdity is something colder. Noise in these texts is not just sound. It is pressure, population, activity, multiplication, grinding grain, moving animals, digging channels, raising walls, living at scale. Humanity is becoming hard to ignore. And that matters, because in one of the great older traditions, humanity was created as a solution to an earlier crisis within the divine order itself. Let us go back there for a little while, because the air changes when we do. Before the flood, before the great argument, before the rescue, the younger gods, the Agigi, are said to have labored under punishing conditions, digging canals, dredging riverbeds, hauling earth, maintaining the vast waterworks that made organized life possible. The details are surprisingly physical. Mud, weight, exhaustion, repetition. 40 years of toil in some versions. Then revolt. I have always loved the small practical violence of the scene. they burn their tools. It is such a worker thing to do. Not a grand philosophical speech, not a shimmering celestial manifesto, just enough. Enough mud, enough baskets, enough digging for someone else. They gather at night, surround Enlil, and the old order suddenly looks fragile. Not eternal, not radiant. Fragile. The council must answer. If it crushes the revolt outright, perhaps everything escalates into divine civil war. If it yields entirely, the labor still has to be done. The canals cannot maintain themselves. The fields cannot distribute water out of polite optimism. Something must change. And so one of the strangest solutions in ancient literature is put forward. Create a new worker class, intelligent enough to obey instructions, mortal enough to remain limited, formed from clay mixed with divine substance, a being not fully of the gods and not merely of mud. Humanity. Some scholars read this symbolically, of course, and very reasonably. Still, the language is uncanny. Clay mixed with flesh and blood of a slain god. Bodies shaped. Womb goddesses assisting. The whole process described with an almost workshop, like a tension that makes it less eerie than later creation myths. Even if this is metaphor, it is metaphor with dirty hands. The first humans are not sung into existence like a lullaby. They are made to solve a labor crisis. That detail changes everything. Humans are not an afterthought. They are policy. They are infrastructure. They are the answer to a near collapse in the divine chain of command. So when humanity later becomes too numerous and too loud, the flood decision is not simply punishment. It is a decision to erase the very solution that stabilized an older rebellion, which means the council is not acting from calm confidence. It is acting from strain. And here Enki becomes deeply important. In these stories, he is not merely another god among many. He is the one who repeatedly refuses to let destruction finish its work when some other route still exists. He cannot always overturn a decree directly, but he can bend around it. He can loosen a knot from behind. He can make a technical obedience perform a practical betrayal. That is one of the most charming and dangerous qualities in all mythology, and perhaps in all politics too. So when the divine assembly settles on the flood, the motion seems formal. Authority approves. The waters will rise. The abyss will open. The heavens will break. Humanity will be washed away. But Enki refuses to let the species vanish. He does not stand and give an heroic speech. That would be too simple and probably fatal. Instead, he goes to a reed wall and speaks to it, knowing the human on the other side will hear. It is one of my favorite moments in the whole tradition. Sly, tender, and quietly rebellious. He does not tell the man openly. He tells the wall. A lovely legal trick. A cosmic bureaucratic wink. Tear down your house. Build a boat. Save life. The instructions are practical. Measurements. Materials. Sequence. Again, the old documentary mood. Even at the edge of extinction, the text thinks in procedures. That may be why it lingers in the mind so stubbornly. Catastrophe comes, but it comes with dimensions. Then the flood. Waters from above and below. Storm. Darkness. Human noise. At last. Replaced by something far more terrible. Silence. When the waters recede, survival itself becomes an accusation. Enlil sees that someone has lived. Someone has broken the decree. There is rage, of course, but also something even more revealing. The council was not united enough to prevent sabotage from within. The highest authority in the old world could be undermined, and not by an enemy army, but by one of its own architects. That is the first great fracture, and once you notice it, you begin to see fractures everywhere. Before the flood, kingship descends from heaven. After the flood, kingship descends again into a changed world. Before the flood, the rulers belong to those vast, impossible durations that do not feel mortal at all. After the flood, time tightens around them. Before the flood, perhaps direct divine management still frames the system. After the flood, instability seems to creep in. Cities rise and fall more quickly. Authority moves more restlessly. The record feels less like a seamless reign and more like a succession of attempts to hold something together. And perhaps that is why the Sumerians kept such anxious respect for sequence. If order can break, then memory becomes a wall against total loss. You list the kings, because forgetting the chain would be another kind of flood. You copy the old names, because once direct rule becomes distant. Lineage is all that still points backward. You preserve the tablets because the world has already ended once. And people who know that tend to become very serious about archives. If you were here with me now, in this imagined scribal room, I think you would hear how quiet it has become. The kind of quiet that follows explanation, but not resolution. We now know a little more about the shape of the first divide. A divine hierarchy. A labor crisis. Humanity fashioned as a remedy. A flood decreed as correction. A God of wisdom refusing correction by saving what was meant to be erased. It is enough to make any later piece feel provisional. And that is where I want to leave you for tonight. Not with a hard stop, but with the slow turning of a larger thought. If the gods could split over whether humanity deserved to continue, if one of the greatest among them chose cunning mercy over official decree, then the old order was never a single smooth structure. It was already full of tension, already carrying rival instincts inside its sacred walls. The flood did not create that tension. It revealed it. Soon, very soon, the struggle will gather around authority itself, around who truly has the right to command heaven, earth, city, temple, water, labor, and fate. Soon tablets of power will be stolen. Territories will be crossed. Underworld and surface will grind against each other. But for now, the waters have only just gone down. The survivors stand in a changed light. The old kings are gone into impossible distance. The new age has begun, smaller, tenser, and far more vulnerable than the one before it. And somewhere, in the soft mud after the flood, a scribe is already preparing fresh clay. Fresh clay, new marks, and a problem no flood had solved. Authority survived the waters, but it did not become gentle. If anything, it became more anxious, more possessive, more aware that once a decree has been bent by clever mercy, every future decree can be questioned too. That is the mood we enter now, not the clean beginning of a world repaired, but the uneasy middle of a system still standing while its hidden beams begin to complain in the dark. There is an object that appears again and again in these old Mesopotamian traditions, and it is described with such gravity that you can almost feel scribes sitting up straighter as they copy its name: the Tablet of Destinies. In Sumerian and Akkadian sources alike, it stands for supreme authority, but not in a vague decorative sense. It is not a pretty symbol worn on a belt while real decisions happen elsewhere. It is the legal center of command. Whoever holds it can decree outcomes. Whoever loses it loses the right to make the world obey. That alone should make you pause. In a culture where tablets recorded contracts, offerings, boundaries, judgments, and transfers of land, the idea of a master tablet is not absurd within its own logic. It is simply the highest possible extension of a familiar system. If small tablets settle property disputes, then this great tablet settles reality itself. If ordinary seals make agreements binding, then this seal binds heaven and earth to the spoken decree. It is administrative imagination elevated until it becomes terrifying. And terrifying it is, because once authority rests in an object, authority can be stolen. One of the clearest stories about this concerns Anzu, the strange winged being who serves near Enlil and watches too carefully. The scene is wonderfully tense in a dry old way. Anzu observes where the tablet is kept. He notices when Enlil is vulnerable. He chooses his moment. No cosmic trumpet sounds. No sky turns red. A theft happens, almost like a palace coup. The tablet is taken, and instantly the structure of command falters. The texts say that with the tablet gone, commands lose force. Rights are interrupted. Order stops moving. There is a hush across the world, a hush that does not feel restful at all. It feels like machinery seizing. That detail has always fascinated me. The problem is not merely that a sacred heirloom has been lost. The problem is operational. Governance itself has stalled. The Great Order, which from a distance always looks so permanent, turns out to depend on possession. This, to me, is where the old stories stop feeling like dreamy myth and start feeling like nightmare administration. Because if supreme authority can be stolen by surprise, then the universe has a security problem. Not a moral allegory. A security problem. The gods panic. They need a champion to recover the tablet. Several refuse. That detail matters too. Refusal means risk is real. In the end, Ninurta, warrior son of Enlil, takes the mission. The battle with Anzu is not simple heroism. It is tactical frustration. Arrows do not work. Attacks fail. The stolen authority can neutralize ordinary force, and then, through advice linked to Enki or Ea in later versions, a strategy emerges. Strike not the whole enemy at once, but the point where his power can no longer be sustained. The wings. The carrying mechanism the means of escape and command. Once severed, the balance shifts. The tablet falls. It is recovered. Order resumes. Now, if you are a scribe or priest living centuries later, what lesson do you learn from this? Probably not just that good triumphs over evil. You learn that the highest level of power is vulnerable to seizure, and that cosmic stability may depend on recovering a stolen instrument before too much time passes. You learn that hierarchy is not smooth. It is contested. You learn that the gods themselves can suffer what any palace fears most, an internal breach. And that is only one theft. In another great tradition, the Enuma Elish, the same object appears in another transfer of power. Tiamat raised her force. Kingu receives the tablet. Later, Marduk defeats that older order and takes it away. Again, the tablet marks legitimacy. Again, authority changes hands through conflict. Again, the world is reorganized, not by patient succession, but by confrontation. It is like watching the same political wound reopen under different names. Honestly, I have always found that repetition more unsettling than any single dramatic episode. A lone rebellion is memorable. Repeated rebellions mean structure is failing. If the Tablet of Destinies can be seized by Anzu, granted to Kingu, involved in crisis after crisis, then the system never solved its central weakness. It merely survived one emergency long enough to face another. You can almost hear the anxiety accumulating across generations. Priests preserving rituals. Kings claiming legitimacy. Cities invoking patron deities. Scribes making copies of copies because once something is written, perhaps it will hold. But the stories they preserve keep whispering the same warning. Possession is fragile. Decree can be interrupted. The center does not remain calm by nature. It remains calm only while no one grabs for it. This is why the old divine conflicts begin to feel less like scattered myths and more like one long political weather system rolling over centuries. The flood decision showed the council could fracture over humanity. The labor revolt showed lower ranks could rebel against imposed burden. The thefts of the tablet show supreme authority could be challenged directly. Each event loosens another stone in the wall. And then there is Inanna. To move from the tablet stories into her descent is to move from stolen authority into violated jurisdiction. It is one of the richest and strangest narratives in the whole ancient world. And beneath all the symbols of death and rebirth, there is something hard and territorial underneath. Inanna does not simply wander into mystery out of poetic curiosity. She approaches the underworld as someone used to rule, and that is exactly the problem. The composition tells us she opened her ear to the great below. Such a lovely phrase. It sounds like listening. In practice, it becomes intrusion. She prepares herself in full regalia: crown, necklace, breastplate, robes, all the visible glamour of power. She goes armed, not with swords but with signs of status. That is often how dangerous people enter a room. They bring legitimacy with them like perfume. At the gate, she is announced to Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, older sister, keeper of another realm. The relationship is already tense. Ereshkigal does not welcome. She hardens. But she does not close the gates entirely. She allows entry under law. and law in the underworld has a colder face than hospitality. 7 gates. At each one, Inanna must surrender something. The stripping is procedural. That is what makes it so effective. A command. An object removed. Another gate. Another removal. The process is less like robbery and more like formal disarmament. Each item taken away is one layer of authority set aside. At first, she is still radiant, then less so, then smaller, then shockingly vulnerable. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal, she stands without the visible architecture of her power. She is not greeted as a sister. She is judged. Then comes one of the starkest moments in Mesopotamian literature. The eye of death is fixed on her. She dies. Her body is hung on a hook. I think many modern readers hurry past that because they know she will return. But try not to hurry. Let the image remain still for a breath. A goddess of heaven and love and war, suspended like butchered flesh, in a realm that does not care about her rank. It is a humiliation, yes, but more than that, it is a declaration that surface authority means nothing below. And now the interesting part. Help is requested. Ninshuber goes out in distress and asks the great gods. Enlil refuses. Nanna refuses. That refusal tells us almost everything. They do not rush to rescue one of their own from obvious injustice. They decide the trespass has consequences. Ereshkigal's jurisdiction is real enough that intervention could trigger a larger conflict. Only Enki agrees to act, and his method once more is not open confrontation, but cunning. Tiny beings are fashioned from the dirt beneath his fingernails. Small, strange, unthreatening. They slip where armies cannot. They enter the underworld not with banners, but with empathy, offering Ereshkigal the kind of recognition no one else has given her in the depth of her pain. It is a brilliant strategy. Not brute force. Not seek. Not declaration. A soft opening in a locked world. Through that opening, Inanna's body is reclaimed and revived. Yet even here, law does not vanish. A replacement must be found. The underworld does not simply lose what it has taken. A life for a life. A place for a place. And so the story turns again, cruelly, toward Dumuzi. He is found comfortable, adorned, unworried, and Inanna's anger flashes. The demons take him. Later there will be sharing, alternating descent, the seasonal rhythm that so many readers remember. But beneath that agricultural poetry, the harder structure remains. A realm was entered. Its laws were enforced. Rescue was achieved only by cunning diplomacy. Balance was restored through substitution, not through overthrow. If you step back now and look at the pattern, it becomes almost impossible not to see the old order as a cluster of semi-independent jurisdictions, each guarded by beings whose cooperation could not be assumed forever. Heaven above, surface cities, sacred precincts, the underworld below, water sources hidden in the earth, fields dependent on canal timing, temples dependent on offerings, authority distributed across realms and offices. It is a magnificent arrangement on paper. In practice, It seems perpetually inches away from dispute. The later texts confirm that these territorial sensitivities mattered intensely. To insult a temple was not merely to damage a building. It was to violate divine property. To cross into another realm without proper standing was not exploration. It was provocation. To withhold offerings, fail in service, or disrupt the expected relation between city and God was to risk much more than poor harvests. It was to shake a bond the literature insists is structurally real. This is why the theft of the tablet and the descent of Inanna belong beside one another. One is about central authority. The other is about boundary enforcement. Together they sketch a world in which power is distributed, prized, and endlessly vulnerable. They also reveal how often Enki appears as the one willing to bend the official line. That matters, because a system can survive enemies for a long time. What it rarely survives is internal divergence at every important level. Workers revolt. Councils split. Tablets are stolen. Realms refuse each other. Rescues happen through loopholes. Every story preserves a workaround. But every workaround also proves the original order is no longer secure. And still the cities continue. That is the haunting part. Uruk rises bright in moonlight. Nippur keeps its sacred gravity. Eridu continues layer after layer. Priests chant. Brewers brew. Canal laborers scrape and lift and curse the heat under their breath. Children run along walls. Merchants count. Fishermen pull nets from reedy water. On the surface, civilization continues to function with almost stubborn grace. But under that grace, the structure is making new sounds. Small cracks, dry pops in the beam, the sort of noises houses make before guests pretend not to notice. Some scholars would tell us these stories mirror city-state politics, and they may be right. A conflict between gods standing in for conflicts between temples, dynasties, and local traditions. Yet, even if that is so, the emotional truth remains the same. The ancient world remembered its order as something repeatedly seized, challenged, invaded, and only barely restored. The myths preserve not confidence, but vigilance. So tonight, while the room grows quieter and your breathing slows a little more, imagine the ancient cities, not in ruin, but in tense fullness. Lamps lit in courtyards. Reed mats cooling after the day. Clay tablets stacked on shelves. Somewhere, a novice scribe rubbing sore fingers after a long lesson. Somewhere, a priest reciting the names of powers older than his city walls. Somewhere, a king lying awake under linen, wondering whether his authority rests in heaven, in law, in force, or merely in the hope that no one stronger reaches for it tomorrow. Because the next phase of the story will not concern symbolism alone. It will concern abandonment, punishment, poisoned land, and those terrible old lines about winds that kill and cities left in dust. Once authority has been stolen enough times, once realms have tested each other's edges enough times, once mercy has embarrassed decree, and decree has threatened creation, the question is no longer whether the structure can fracture. The question is, how badly? And far away, in those oldest tablets, the answer is already waiting in the language of laments. where gods leave their cities before destruction begins, as though even they knew the final argument would not be survivable in the old way. Before destruction comes a very quiet motion. A god leaves by a gate before dawn. A temple door remains shut a little longer than usual. An offering table stands prepared, but no presence answers. Somewhere a priest notices that the ritual still has its words, yet the room has lost its listener. That is the mood of the lamentations. Not sudden surprise, but a slow, terrible realization that protection is withdrawing before the blow falls. By around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the written record changes tone. Earlier texts can be tense, yes, but they still imagine a world in which divine power is near enough to negotiate with, deceive, flatter, or anger. The lamentation literature feels different. It feels like writing from the aftermath of abandonment. The gods are no longer merely quarreling above the city. They are leaving it. The lament for is among the most haunting. Its grief is organized, almost ceremonial, but the details inside it are sharp enough to sting through the formal music. Enlil has decreed destruction. The good winds are taken away. Evil winds are summoned. Mourns. Sumer mourns. The language repeats like slow blows from a mallet, steady, inescapable, making sure the listener does not mistake catastrophe for accident. This was decided. This was authorized. That insistence matters. Ancient people knew what raids looked like. They knew what siege looked like. They knew what famine felt like and how floodwaters smelled when it lingered too long in a canal. Yet these laments separate ordinary warfare from something additional, something layered over it. Enemy armies may appear. Elamites may enter. Gates may fall. But the texts also speak of the evil wind, the storm, the covering force that wraps the land like cloth, enters houses, weakens bodies, poisons what should nourish, and leaves the country itself altered. I do not want to force a modern explanation too quickly. It is debated. Some read this as poetic description of drought, dust storm, famine, epidemic, and social collapse combining into one remembered horror. That is plausible. Very plausible. Others notice the strange consistency in the effects. Water spoiled, livestock dying, people overcome where they sit, birds gone silent or fled, fields staying barren, ruins making the living sick. That consistency gives the imagination plenty to do in the dark. If you listen carefully to the lament, the evil wind is not merely a metaphor for invasion. Armies are described separately. The wind is a second thing, a companion in destruction, or perhaps the truer destroyer. It blankets. It covers. It prostrates. It does not seem to care whether its victims are soldier or child, roulé or servant, even living or already dead. There is something chillingly indifferent in that. Human violence always contains intention and preference. This old wind feels more like a condition that spreads. And the cities do not suffer alone. That is another reason the texts disturb. The catastrophe is regional. Sumer, Akkad, Nippur, Eridu, More than one center, more than one collapse, more than one divine house emptied before the blow. The pattern becomes harder to explain as one isolated military disaster. It begins to look like system failure, or perhaps system attack. The curse of Agade takes this further. There, Naram-Sin offends Enlil by violating the sacred precinct, the Ekur. The punishment is vast, but what strikes me most is the language of aftermath. Fields no longer yielding grain, flooded meadows giving no fish, gardens empty of sweetness, rain withheld, canals failing, prices spiraling, children and adults sold for almost nothing, no one tending ditches, no one placing a shovel in the earth, weeds where organized agriculture once held a disciplined green. That last image lingers with unusual force. Weeds returning to irrigated order. It is one of the saddest pictures in all ancient writing. Civilization is, among other things, the patient refusal to let weeds have the final word. To maintain a field means to insist, season after season. That order still deserves effort. When a text tells you that no one places a shovel in the field anymore, it is telling you that the moral and practical contract of the world has broken. The people are gone, or too weak, or too frightened, or too dead. And then there is the dust. Houses become dust. Palaces become pits. Clouds rise from where built things once stood. Again, perhaps this is poetic compression for conquest and burning. Mud brick structures do indeed collapse into earth when neglected or smashed. Yet the texts handle these details with such repeated emphasis that they begin to feel like witness language. People trying to say what it looked like when things they trusted stopped holding shape. This is where the old question about the Anunnaki final war returns. Quieter now, but more insistent. If the divine order had already suffered labor revolt, flood division, authority theft, and territorial breach, what would the last stage of that conflict look like once human civilization had become large, dense, indispensable, and difficult to govern? The laments seem to answer indirectly. It would look like withdrawal from direct rule. It would look like selective abandonment. It would look like destructive forces released into the human landscape with such severity that even the victors, if there were victors, would no longer remain among the ruins in the old intimate way. One of the most chilling habits of these texts is the way they describe the gods moving out before the catastrophe. Nana leaves Inanna leaves Uruk. Enlil leaves Nippur. They do not fall with their cities in noble solidarity. They depart. The songs make this emotionally unbearable because they treat the departure as betrayal and necessity at once. The gods are not exactly fleeing in panic, nor are they coldly absent from the start. They are withdrawing from places they once inhabited. Their furniture, offerings, songs, and chambers remain. Their presence does not. If you were a person living through such a period, how would you understand it? Perhaps not as theology. Perhaps as plain fact. The god has gone. The city has been left behind. The enemy enters after that, or the wind comes after that, or the fields fail after that. Cause and sequence would become memory. Centuries later, a scribe copies the lament, and the pain remains because once a house has known presence, absence becomes a physical thing. I have always found it useful to imagine the sensory world of this collapse very slowly. Not the grand aerial view, but the ground-level experience. Dust in the nostrils, reed doors slapping in a dry wind, oxen ribs showing under hide, water from a canal carrying an odd taste, a mother quieting a child because there is no food left worth promising, a temple singer performing the old lines into a sanctuary that no longer feels inhabited, a merchant holding silver that cannot buy enough grain to matter, a field once measured and weeded, now gone coarse under the sun. The silence of birds is perhaps the worst detail of all, because birds are such casual witnesses in ordinary life. If even they leave, the land itself has changed its mind. The texts also preserve references to things that sound less like ordinary weapons than like dangerous divine means. In the Lugail, Ninurta judges stones after battle and assigns them fates, properties, uses, and curses. Some stones illuminate, some burn, some purify water, some are feared and closely handled. In the era epic, Marduk's weapons require restoration and careful treatment, as though their maintenance is itself perilous. Elsewhere, radiance clings to divine beings and objects in ways that inspire terror, not just beauty. Mainstream readings take these as symbolic, and again, that may often be correct. But even symbolic language comes from some pressure of observation. A dangerous stone, a burning object, a radiant thing that should not be approached casually. It all begins to gather into a cloudy outline. Not proof. No. Proof is a much sterner creature, but a mood, a pattern, a recurring suggestion that the forces available to these divine actors exceed the scale of ordinary Bronze Age arms. If the final conflicts among the Anunnaki reached into the human world, then perhaps the old texts are trying to describe effects their writers did not possess a proper technical vocabulary for. What else could they do but compare? Heat from heaven, evil wind, terrible radiance, fire that overcomes, dust where walls once stood, bitter water, unfruitful ground. They had no cleaner language than that, and perhaps no need for cleaner language. Their task was not to satisfy future laboratories. Their task was to remember that something dreadful happened and that it came with divine authorization. Now let us bring in one more strand, quieter but in some ways even more revealing. The omen texts. Eclipse omens. Especially, to a modern mind it is easy to smile at them. If the moon darkens in such and such a month, then a king will die. If the eclipse begins in one quarter and clears in another, then Elam, or Akkad, or some other land will fall. We call it superstition and move on. Yet the sheer effort devoted to these omen systems should make us more patient. These were not scraps of village folklore. They were copied, studied, categorized, and refined for centuries by serious scribes. Why do that unless the patterns mattered? Perhaps the omens were self-fulfilling. Perhaps frightened kings made bad choices after hearing them. Perhaps court factions weaponized them. That certainly happened in ancient politics. But another possibility lingers. The scholars of Mesopotamia may have believed celestial patterns preceded catastrophe because, in their historical memory, Catastrophe really had preceded certain celestial patterns, often enough to teach vigilance. In that case, omen literature becomes less childish and more traumatic. It becomes a civilization watching the sky because its ancestors once learned that terrible earthly changes and strange heavenly signs belonged too closely together to ignore. This helps explain one of the strangest shifts of all. After around the collapse of the old Sumerian order, divine presence in the literature becomes more distant. Gods remain, of course. Religion remains. Temples remain. Priests remain, but the flavor changes. Earlier texts treat gods almost like local rulers whose households need tending. Later texts more often lament absence, invoke distance, or frame divine connection through ritual mediation rather than everyday cohabitation. Something has thinned. From a mainstream perspective, that is theological evolution. Perfectly respectable explanation. From a more literal one, it could mean withdrawal. The beings once treated as resident powers are no longer resident. Humanity is left to govern itself under weaker signals. The old direct administration ends. That possibility, whether true or not, gives the laments their peculiar ache. They are not only mourning dead people and fallen walls. They are mourning a relationship that will not return in the same form. The gods were here, they say. Then they were not. And the not was final enough to reshape the whole architecture of civilization. Yet, and this is important, the story does not end in total annihilation. Humanity survives. That may be the deepest surprise in all this old sorrow. Whether the Anunnaki were divine metaphors, encoded memory, advanced beings, or some mixture of all three in the minds of the scribes, their conflict did not erase the species. Cities were destroyed. Yes. Kingdoms fell. Language itself shifted, with Sumerian eventually surviving, mostly in schools and liturgical memory. But people endured. They rebuilt. They adapted. They continued counting, farming, arguing, marrying, storing grain, studying the sky, and pressing stories into clay so the next collapse might at least not arrive in perfect ignorance. There is something quietly brave in that. In the middle of loss, they made archives. If you listen very carefully, the surviving tablets seem almost less interested in proving a theory than in preserving a warning. This happened. We do not fully understand it. The gods were divided. The land suffered. The cities were emptied. The wind was evil. The sky signaled trouble. The rulers changed. The old intimacy ended. Remember this. I think that is why these texts continue to pull at people. Not merely because they are mysterious, though they are. Not merely because they contain gods and impossible weapons and a world before the flood, though they certainly do. They endure because they are records of people trying to think after trauma without giving up on meaning. They refuse to shrug. They refuse to say nothing can be known. Instead, they write in patient, unsettling detail and trust that later generations will sit down in quieter rooms and try again. So here we are, in one of those quieter rooms, with the candlelight low and the old clay dry in its drawer, and the possible interpretations spread before us like three roads across a dark plain. Perhaps it was all mythic language for human collapse, drought, invasion, and institutional failure. Perhaps it was symbolic literature preserving ancient wisdom in narrative dress. Perhaps it really was memory of actual conflicts among powerful non-human rulers whose departure changed everything. I will not force one answer over your resting mind tonight. Ancient texts dislike being cornered. They prefer to linger at the edge of certainty and let us feel around their shape. But I will say this: whatever happened around the end of the Sumerian age mattered enough to be copied for nearly 2,000 years afterward. That alone is extraordinary. Cultures do not preserve elaborate laments, king lists, flood accounts, omen systems, and divine conflict traditions with such devotion unless those materials continue to answer some need. And perhaps the need was simple. Perhaps people wanted to know why the world they inherited felt dimmer than the one their oldest stories described. The final war. Then, whether literal or symbolic, is also the story of that dimming. Of a world once governed at close range becoming a world governed at a distance. Of direct decree becoming ritual memory. Of cities losing their divine residents and learning, painfully, to survive anyway. Outside the old ruined precincts, reeds still moved in canal wind. The moon still crossed above broken brick. Somewhere, boys still learned their signs on fresh tablets. Somewhere, old men still argued over fields. Somewhere a woman still lit a lamp and whispered a prayer to a goddess she had never seen but whose absence felt like inherited weather. Life went on, which is sometimes the gentlest and most stubborn miracle in all of history. And so the ancient voices do not close the mystery for us. They leave it open, deliberately or not. They hand us fragments. A line about gods making war on gods. A flood dividing time in two. A stolen tablet. A dead goddess on a hook. A poisoned land. A city left in dust. A king list that grows suddenly mortal. They do not ask us for easy belief. They ask for careful attention. That may be enough for tonight. Let the questions settle. Let the old winds quiet down. Let the ruined cities sit where they have sat for 4,000 years, under stars that have watched every interpretation come and go. The clay remains patient. The scribes remain silent. The land healed, then changed, then healed again. And whatever the Anunnaki once were in text, in memory, in power, or in fear, their age passed. Humanity inherited the silence after. The night after a civilization breaks is rarely loud. It is mostly counting. Counting sacks of barley that never arrived. Counting children asleep and children missing. Counting cracks in a wall that still stands, though only by courtesy. Counting how many times the moon has waxed and thinned since the gods were last said to enter their own shrines. That is where the old clay begins to feel especially human to me. Because, after all, the divine counsels and terrible winds, what remains in the hands of the scribes is still the same small act. Press, mark, remember. So let us continue softly, with that image in mind. A lamp burning low. A tablet damp enough to take the wedge cleanly. A scholar in a city rebuilt atop ash, copying a much older line about destruction and trying to decide whether the ancestors were describing a miracle, a weapon, a judgment, or simply the worst week in history with the wrong vocabulary for it. This is where the story bends inward, not away from the Anunnaki, but deeper into the question of how the ancient world understood them once the age of direct presence seemed to be over. The old texts survive because later generations still found them necessary. That alone deserves more reverence than it usually receives. Clay is heavy. Storage is expensive. Scribes do not spend months copying what nobody values. A tradition persists because it keeps answering a wound. For some, the answer must have been simple. The old stories were true in the way sacred things are true, not because every event happened exactly as described, but because the stories captured the shape of catastrophe. In that reading, the War of the Anunnaki is not a newspaper record from heaven, but a vast symbolic language for what Bronze Age collapse feels like from the inside. The gods quarrel because the kingdoms quarrel. The tablet of destinies changes hands because legitimacy changes hands. Cities are abandoned by their divine patrons because real temple systems fail. Kings are defeated. Grain roots break. And people experience political collapse as cosmic desertion. There is wisdom in that. We should not dismiss it because it is cautious. Caution has saved many good historians from making absolute fools of themselves. And there is something deeply convincing about the symbolic reading when you sit with the habits of ancient literature. Gods in old stories often carry the shape of institutions. A storm god can be weather, yes, but also empire, law, season, inheritance, and military force at once. A descent to the underworld can be a territorial conflict, a fertility cycle, a mourning ritual, and a political drama, all in the same breath. Ancient minds did not build the hard walls modern categories enjoy. They let metaphor and administration sleep in the same bed. If that is what happened here, then the final war becomes the grand memory language of a civilization watching its entire model of order fail. Climate stress dries the land. Invasion shatters cities. Trade routes collapse. Local loyalties harden. Priests lose influence. Dynasties fail. The old confidence that heaven and city mirror one another is broken. So the scribes say the gods fought. Of course they did. What else could it mean when every level of existence seems to have turned against every other? What else could it mean when the sky withholds rain? The canals fail. The temple is violated. The king is powerless. And the people die in houses that once felt protected. To say the gods went to war may simply be the most accurate emotional sentence possible. Yet the story refuses to stay only there. It keeps tugging us back toward procedure, specificity, odd little details that feel less like grand metaphor and more like stubborn memory. A stone with dangerous handling requirements. A fire that kills in a particular way. A wind that covers and contaminates. A record of eclipses tied not to vague dread but to named regions and named outcomes. A king list that shifts from impossible reigns to merely extraordinary ones without pausing to explain itself. The texts behave like witnesses who speak in symbols because they must, but who are also trying very hard not to lose the texture of what they saw. That is why the second interpretation has such quiet power. Perhaps these works preserve encoded knowledge. Not crude fiction, not literal documentary, but memory transformed into instruction. The old scribes may have understood that catastrophe repeats in patterns. They may have known that certain configurations, celestial, political, agricultural, produce danger when they converge. The stories then become storage devices. Narrative is easier to remember than data. A god stealing the tablet of destinies is easier to teach than a lecture on the instability of centralized legitimacy. Enki speaking to the reed wall is easier to preserve than a treatise on administrative dissent and covert resistance. The evil wind is easier to carry forward than a technical report on environmental contamination. You know that feeling when a family keeps repeating one strange story at gatherings, and as a child you think it is only entertainment. Then, years later, you realize it was the household's safe way of preserving a terrible truth. That is a little how these texts feel. They may be stories standing guard over information too large, too painful, or too difficult to preserve in plain speech. Under that reading, the flood is not simply punishment. It is the memory of overwhelming regional catastrophe and the techniques of survival wrapped in sacred narrative. The labor revolt is not only divine melodrama. It is a meditation on exploited systems reaching breaking point, on why forced labor always breeds crisis. The Tablet of Destinies is not just a magic object. It is an encoded lesson that legitimacy and command, once concentrated, become targets. Inanna's descent is not merely a fertility myth. It is a warning about jurisdiction, overreach, and the cost of entering another sovereign system while dressed in your own authority. The Lamentations then become the archive of what happens when warnings are ignored for too long. There is something almost tender in that possibility. It suggests the ancients were trying to rescue understanding from ruin, pressing it into clay so that people thousands of years later, perhaps lying awake under electric light instead of oil lamps, might still learn what kinds of pride, imbalance, and internal fracture tend to end worlds. And then, of course, there is the third possibility, the one that hovers at the edge of polite scholarship, like a bird everyone hears in the rafters, but no one wants to name too loudly. What if the texts are closer to literal than we have allowed ourselves to consider? What if the beings called Anunnaki were treated as gods because, to the people recording them, there was no cleaner category available? Not immaterial abstractions, but physical powers, long-lived rulers, administrators of early cities, possessors of capabilities so far beyond Bronze Age technique that divine language was simply the nearest vessel. I say this carefully, because once one becomes careless in such territory, nonsense rushes in dressed like revelation. Still, careful does not mean cowardly. The texts repeatedly describe the Anunnaki as embodied, hungry, angry, territorial, rank-conscious, and politically divided. They assign cities. They hold councils. They own precincts. They punish trespass. They leave. If a people truly believed their earliest civilization was taught and organized by such beings, then the literary record we now call mythology may also be the nearest surviving form of historical memory. In that frame, the final war becomes exactly what the scattered references imply. Not one tidy battle with banners and trumpets, but a long deterioration of relations among powerful factions. First, the labor crisis, then the human solution, then disagreement over whether that solution should endure, then thefts of authority, then territorial conflicts, then repeated disruptions of legitimacy. Finally, the use of devastating means severe enough to poison land, empty cities, and force a retreat from direct governance altogether. I think what makes this interpretation so haunting is not the possibility of advanced beings. Human imagination has always loved grand visitors. No, what unsettles is the bureaucratic tone of the sources. They do not sound like people inventing a fantasy epic from scratch. They sound like people filing grief into categories they hope future generations can still parse. That does not prove the literal reading. It does keep it from being dismissed with an easy laugh. And perhaps the real trouble is that all three interpretations can be true at once in different ways. Ancient memory often works like river sediment. There is flood mud, temple ash, reed pollen, fish bone, and broken brick, all pressed into one layer. Later readers want to separate each thing into a pure pile, but the deposit itself insists on mixture. A real war may become symbolic. A symbolic story may preserve data. A theological poem may describe actual environmental effects in accurate detail while misunderstanding their mechanism. The clay does not care which category comforts us most. It simply keeps what was pressed into it. This is why the old omen texts matter so much in the middle of the story. People like to imagine omen literature as primitive superstition, but that judgment says more about modern vanity than ancient intelligence. The Babylonian and Assyrian scholars who tracked eclipses, planetary motion, and atmospheric anomalies were not fools staring upward in decorative fear. They were observers, system builders, pattern keepers. If they associated certain sky events with political collapse or environmental disaster, there was likely a reason rooted in either repeated historical coincidence, careful statecraft, or both. One of the newly translated eclipse omen groups is striking precisely because of its confidence. If an eclipse occurs in this form, destruction of this region. If, in another form, death of the king. If obscured from the center all at once, ruin follows elsewhere. These are not dreamy mutterings. They are clauses. Conditional, technical, almost annoying in their confidence. Like an accountant who also happens to think the moon is filing reports on earthly doom. And why not? If your civilization believes previous catastrophes came wrapped in signs, then watching the sky is not irrational. It is responsible. It is what cautious descendants do after surviving something their ancestors barely managed to record. The more I sit with these materials, the more the atmosphere around them feels less like fantasy and more like inherited vigilance. Whole libraries devoted to not being surprised again. Whole priesthoods trained to notice the slight wrongness in the sky, the field, the birth, the river, the throne room. You do not build an omen culture that extensive unless memory has taught you that disaster often announces itself before it arrives, though perhaps only to those patient enough to look. Now bring your mind back, gently, to the museums. Not because we need modern institutions to bless the old stories, but because the journey of the tablets themselves adds another layer of strangeness. Fragments from Nineveh, excavated in the 1850s. Pieces in Philadelphia. Pieces in Paris. Pieces in Baghdad. Drawers full of uncatalogued or barely examined shards. One fragment only 4 inches wide, carrying a phrase no one had seen elsewhere. When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki, how many more lines sleep in storage, misfiled, unphotographed, or too broken to tempt a busy researcher on a tired afternoon? It is almost comical in a grim way. Humanity survived the collapse of divine rule and then managed to misplace part of the archive in a cabinet. There is a sort of accidental mercy in that, too. The story remains unfinished because history itself is unfinished. Every translation is provisional. Every reading sits under revision. A sign that once seemed certain may turn under another scholar's lamp and mean something softer or stranger. That uncertainty is not a flaw. It is the honest atmosphere of the subject. We are listening across 4,000 years to broken clay, written by people who themselves were already interpreting older disasters. So perhaps the wisest way to continue is not to demand one clean answer, but to let the possibilities breathe beside one another for a while longer. In the next stretch of the tale, we will move closer to the ending these texts imply. Not the end of humanity, but the end of something more intimate. The age in which the gods of these records, whether literal rulers, symbolic powers, or encoded memory systems, still seemed near enough to quarrel over cities face to face. We will step into the silence that follows their withdrawal, and into the question that remains hanging in the air like the dust after a wall collapses. What exactly left? And what exactly stayed behind for us to inherit? For now, rest with the image of the scribe. His hand pauses. Outside, the city is quieter than it should be. He has copied the line about evil wind. He has copied the line about the god departing. He has copied the old impossible rains and the mortal ones that follow. He knows he cannot solve the whole mystery. Still, he writes, because even when certainty fails, memory should not. By the time the last copies of these old stories were pressed into clay, the world they described had already become remote, almost tender in its distance. That is what makes the silence afterward feel so large. The wars, if wars they were, had ended long before. The cities had risen again in altered forms. New kings spoke new dialects. Empires came wearing other names. And still the literature remembered an earlier age when divine power had seemed local, embodied, and dangerously involved in the management of fields, floods, and walls. That is where we go now, into the silence that followed. Imagine a city after the gods have ceased to walk in it directly. The temple is still there. The brick platform still catches the sun. Priests still wash, dress, shammed, and pour. Grain is still counted. Lambs are still led to offering. Calendars still matter. The moon is still watched. Nothing in the visible procedure has collapsed completely. Yet something in the atmosphere has withdrawn, like warmth leaving a stone after sunset. The forms remain, but the immediate answer does not. Ritual becomes more deliberate because presence feels less automatic. Later Mesopotamian prayers tell this story without trying to. They often sound like messages sent toward distance. How long will you remain angry? How long will you hide your face? The gods of earlier literature can be infuriating, cruel, divided, erratic, but they are near. The gods of later lament and prayer are sometimes worse in a sadder way. They are absent. Their anger is inferred from their silence. Their will must be guessed from omens, dreams, eclipses, entrails, winds, and the uneasy mathematics of the sky. If the Anunnaki were always symbolic, then this is the symbolic shift toward transcendence. If they were real administrators of a vanished order, then this is the age after departure. In either case, the emotional result is the same. Humanity inherits responsibility under weakened supervision. There is a kind of cold adulthood in that. No loving grand speech. No heavenly graduation ceremony. Just empty rooms and surviving paperwork. The king lists themselves seem to feel it. Before the flood, rains are impossible, almost geological in scale. After the flood, still long, but smaller. After later collapses, smaller again, more recognizably human, tied to genealogy and local dynasty rather than to that unsettling phrase, kingship lowered from heaven. The phrase does not disappear entirely, which is perhaps the eeriest part. Divine sanction continues, but it changes character. Heaven now confers legitimacy at a distance. It does not seem to sit on the throne in the old way. That distinction matters. It means memory of direct rule persisted even after direct rule did not. And then there is the land itself. The source texts refuse to let us forget that the catastrophe around the end of the Sumerian world was not only political. The earth suffered. Fields failed. Water spoiled. Populations moved. Cities became difficult or impossible to inhabit. Some scholars connect this firmly to drought, salinization, shifting river courses, and the broader climate event around 2200 BCE. They may well be right. Those pressures were real, but the literature keeps layering another memory over them, something sudden, sanctioned, and frighteningly intentional. I find the phrase evil wind almost impossible to shake. Not because it proves a hidden technology. It proves nothing by itself. But because it is such a good phrase for the way catastrophe often arrives in human memory, invisible until it is already inside the lungs. It covers. It enters. It leaves things standing but altered. It is atmospheric in the deepest sense, even if one strips away every speculative thought and reads it only as dust storm, epidemic, or poisoned air from environmental collapse. The phrase remains perfect. It remembers how destruction can feel impersonal and total at once. One passage from the lament tradition keeps returning to me. Inside there is death. Outside there is death. It is almost unbearable in its simplicity. The house does not save you. The street does not save you. Staying and fleeing both fail. That is how real catastrophe feels to those caught in it. Every option becomes merely a different style of fear. If the Anunnaki final war was a literary way of preserving such experience, then it is preserving it with painful accuracy. And yet, even there, the story does not surrender to total darkness. Humanity survives. That fact is easy to miss because the laments are so saturated with grief. But survival is their hidden frame. No one composes a lament from inside complete extinction. No one copies it for centuries after, unless there was enough continuity left to build schools. train scribes, maintain temple libraries, and feel that the old sorrow still mattered. Survival is the quiet contradiction underneath every line. This is why the end of direct divine governance, if that is what it was, can be read two ways at once. From the Sumerian perspective, it was loss. Traumatic, humiliating, destabilizing loss. The gods departed. The cities suffered. The old order broke, and humans were left with hunger, weather, memory, and each other. But from another perspective, colder and perhaps more hopeful, it was also emancipation by catastrophe. Humanity had to learn how to continue without daily reliance on those higher factions. We were forced into historical adulthood by the collapse of the old household. That does not make the collapse good. It simply means history sometimes gives maturity as a punishment. The centuries that followed show what humans do with punishment. Babylonian mathematics flowered. Astronomers tracked the heavens with astonishing discipline. Legal systems sharpened. Archives grew. Royal inscriptions multiplied. Scholars in later ages became better readers of the sky than their predecessors, perhaps precisely because the old disasters had taught them that signs matter. Empires rose with a more mediated theology, where kings were chosen by gods rather than seated as their near equals. In other words, the world did not become smaller after the silence. It became more human. I have always found that strangely moving. The same species described in older texts as noisy laborers, inconvenient, multiplying, difficult to control, eventually becomes the keeper of the very records that preserve the memory of divine conflict. The workers inherited the archive. The replacement labor force became the historian. And what did that historian preserve? Not victory songs alone, not flattering propaganda alone, but warnings, doubts, contradictions, and unresolved mysteries. That is a sign of intellectual seriousness. A foolish civilization preserves only praise. A wounded but intelligent one preserves confusion too. It says, "This happened," or something like this happened, and we do not fully know how to say it cleanly, but let it not be forgotten. When alternative readers look at the Anunnaki material and ask whether advanced non-human powers once ruled here, I understand the impulse. The texts invite it. They leave the door open, just enough that imagination leans through. When mainstream scholars reply that symbolism, politics, ecology, and myth explain the data well enough, I understand that too. Caution is part of honesty. The difficulty is that the ancient sources themselves seem built to trouble both sides. They are too concrete to rest comfortably as pure allegory, and too theologically shaped to function as simple modern reportage. So, we are left with a twilight category: cultural memory of transformative trauma. That phrase may be the most faithful one available. It allows for real events, mythic framing, symbolic amplification, and partial technical observation all at once. It admits that people can witness something terrible, survive it, misunderstand some of its causes, understand some of its effects perfectly, and transmit all of that together to descendants. And that may be exactly what happened here. A labor revolt became the memory of why humanity was made. Political fracture became the memory of divine faction. Administrative instability became the memory of the tablet of destiny's changing hands. Environmental collapse and war became the memory of evil winds, searing heat, poisoned water, and cities abandoned by their gods. Generations later, scribes still copied the material because the deep structure of the warning remained true, even if the surface mechanisms had become obscure. That warning, when reduced to its bones, is simple enough to whisper, systems collapse first at the level of relationship. Workers against rulers, brothers against brothers, realms against realms, cities against their own protective order. Once the bond between authority and responsibility breaks, catastrophe no longer needs a single cause. Drought, war, disease, migration, panic, all of them rush into the opening at once. This is why the final war, whether literal or literary, matters beyond curiosity. It is a study in compounded failure. No one crisis ends the world. The world ends in layers. Labor revolt unresolved. Humanity created a solution. Humanity becoming problem. Flood decision. Secret rescue. Authority theft. Territorial breach. Ritual legitimacy weakened. Cities competing. Land stressed. Divine support withdrawn. Then the great breaking. By the time the dust rises, the true catastrophe has already been accumulating for centuries. If you were standing there with me among the old ruins at dusk, with the heat loosening from the brick and the museum hush of history settling over everything, I think the most surprising feeling would not be fear. It would be recognition. We know this pattern, even now. Perhaps that is another reason the tablets refuse to sleep quietly. They do not merely tell us about ancient Sumer. They tell us about how all complicated orders begin to sound when they are nearing strain. Too much noise. Too much labor. Too much concentration of authority. Too many rival jurisdictions. Too much confidence that systems can be bent indefinitely without ever snapping. And then, after all that tension, there comes the most humble and astonishing chapter. Humans carry on. The old direct age fades. The gods become more distant in literature. The cities become more mortal. Kings claim favor rather than daily companionship. The temple remains a center, but not quite the same kind of residence. The scribal schools continue. Children still learn the signs. Farmers still argue with canal levels. Traders still complain about weights and seals. Somewhere someone falls in love. Somewhere someone cheats at grain accounts. Somewhere someone listens to a grandmother telling a story about the days when heaven sat closer to the ground. That image comforts me more than it should. History survives, not only through great monuments, but through boring persistence. Civilization, after the supposed departure of the Anunnaki, is still people doing stubborn little tasks well enough to see another planting season. Even the mystery itself becomes part of inheritance. The story does not resolve because perhaps it was never meant to resolve fully. A clean explanation would close the archive. Ambiguity keeps it alive. Each generation must decide again. Mythology, encoded wisdom, historical memory of literal events. Some braid of all three, the question stays open, and so the tablets remain active rather than dead. They still produce thought. They still ask things of us. They still create that peculiar ancient feeling that somebody very long ago wanted urgently to be understood and also knew they could not make themselves perfectly clear. That, I think, is the truest ending available for tonight's stretch of the journey. Not certainty, but stewardship. We have inherited the fragments. The museums hold them, yes, but the deeper custody now belongs to every careful reader willing to let the old lines remain complicated. The British Museum drawers, the Pennsylvania fragments, the Oxford prism, the copies from Babylonian schools, the words about flood, kingship, evil wind, theft, descent, abandonment, and dust. They are all still here because enough generations refused to let the silence erase them entirely. And what was the silence? Perhaps it was the absence of the gods. Perhaps it was the end of a political theology. Perhaps it was the cooling of trauma into literature. Perhaps it was simply history, learning how to sound after the sky no longer came down to argue with the city face to face. Whatever it was, the silence did not win completely. The clay spoke through it. So let us leave this part of the story there, in a room below the museum, or in a scribal chamber 3,000 years earlier, with tablets stacked like sleeping birds in the dark. Outside, the world keeps moving. Rivers change course. Empires rename the land. Wind brushes dust across foundations older than memory. Inside, the signs wait. Tiny wedges. Patient marks. The oldest kind of defiance. We were here, they say. Something happened. We remembered. And because they remembered, we can still sit beside the low fire of these ancient questions and listen a little longer before the night carries us deeper into the final chapters. If you stay with a story long enough, it stops sounding like a theory and starts sounding like a room. That is how this one feels now. Not a courtroom where one interpretation defeats another, but a chamber made of clay shelves, lamp smoke, reed baskets, and copied fragments, where every tablet gives off a slightly different heat. One says flood. One says kingship descended from heaven. One says the gods withdrew. One says an evil wind covered the land. One whispers about stolen authority. One remembers a city where the birds did not sing. None of them settle the question alone. Together, they create a pressure that is difficult to ignore. So let us sit in that pressure for a little while longer. By the late first millennium BCE, the great old names were still being copied, but they already belonged to deep time. Students in Babylon, Uruk, and elsewhere learned ancient Sumerian as a learned language, the way later scholars learned Latin. Careful, precise, slightly reverent, and perhaps a little sleepy after long afternoons with grammar lists. The language of the first cities was no longer the language of the street. It had become something preserved, something formal, something that opened doors backward. That alone is telling. Civilizations do not usually preserve dead languages for 2,000 years, unless those languages still guard important things. And the things guarded in Sumerian were not small. They were the oldest accounts of kingship, flood, divine assembly, labor, rebellion, destruction, and withdrawal. They were the grammar of beginnings and endings. If you were a later Mesopotamian scholar trying to understand why the world looked the way it did, why kings ruled but did not quite shine the way the oldest rulers were said to shine, why temples still stood but divine presence felt thinner, why omen compendia existed at all, you would have to go back there. You would have to sit with those first uneasy records and ask what kind of world required this much remembering. Honestly, that is what keeps pulling me back to the tablets themselves. Not the sensational question first, but the quieter one. Why did so many generations think these texts were still necessary? A culture can preserve a beautiful myth because it is beautiful. It can preserve a heroic legend because it flatters the nation. But the Anunnaki material is often not flattering. It is unstable. It shows councils breaking apart, authority stolen, punishments that go too far, rescues that violate decrees, rulers abandoning cities, and humans caught in consequences they did not design. This is not a triumphal archive. It is an archive of dangerous memory. That danger may be exactly why it endured. If the old stories were purely symbolic, then they symbolized something no later civilization wanted to repeat. If they preserved encoded wisdom, then the wisdom was worth carrying through dynastic change, invasion, and language death. If they documented real events involving real powers, then later humanity was living amid ruins large enough to justify endless caution. Under every reading, the motive is the same. Remember this, because forgetting it would make us stupid. There is a small, almost funny sadness in the way modern people often handle ancient literature. We want the old world to either behave like modern journalism or like tidy fantasy. We become impatient when it refuses both roles. But the clay does not care for our impatience. It was written by people who lived close to floodplain mud, temple bureaucracy, livestock inventories, eclipse watching, and intergenerational grief. Of course, their literature would mingle record, omen, prayer, myth, and practical intelligence. Life did not come sorted for them either. That is why the end of the Anunnaki story, if we can call it an end, is so difficult to pin down. There is no single tablet that says plainly, on this day, the final war concluded, the surviving Anunnaki departed, and humanity inherited the cities. Instead, there is a change in texture across the archive. A before and after. Before, the gods inhabit cities with startling intimacy. After, they remain powerful, but more remote. Before, kingship descends from heaven in a strong, direct sense. After, kings seek favor and sanction through ritual distance. Before, the literature can still imagine direct interventions with terrifying immediacy. After, even when gods remain active, they feel less like resident rulers and more like high powers consulted through signs. A historian would call that theological development. A storyteller might call it the cooling of presence. A frightened witness might call it abandonment. And all three would be talking about the same thing. The old lamentations do not hide the pain of that cooling. They are not modern secular accounts saying institutions failed and human systems reorganized. They sound more like people standing in a doorway after a household has broken, noticing what objects are still there and what warmth is gone. The gates remain. The offerings remain. The canals remain in damaged form. But Nana is gone from Ur. Enlil has withdrawn. Inanna has left her city. The language is spatial, intimate, domestic. The gods have not merely ceased to answer. They have left the room. That image carries so much sorrow because it suggests that even survival felt like exile. And yet, the very existence of later Mesopotamian brilliance tells another story alongside the sorrow. Human beings, left with partial inheritance and damaged systems, proved spectacularly adaptable. They observed the heavens with obsessive care. They refined mathematics, law, and administration. They built libraries large enough to preserve the memory of their own vulnerability. They became curators of lost directness. If the Anunnaki once managed civilization, then humanity became civilization's careful maintenance staff afterward, and did a surprisingly good job with limited supervision. There is an irony there I cannot resist. The old texts sometimes frame humans as laborers created to relieve divine exhaustion. Yet by the end of this long arc, it is humans doing the most divine-seeming work of all, preserving order through memory, measure, ritual, writing, and patient repair. The noisy workforce becomes the steward of cosmic paperwork. That is almost beautiful enough to make Enki smile, if Enki was ever the kind of being who smiled at outcomes. And perhaps he was. Among all the old powers, he remains the most persistently human in temperament, not because he is weak, but because he keeps choosing complexity over purity. He refuses the clean erasure. He works around decrees rather than praising their stern logic. He saves by indirection. He solves problems sideways. He makes room for damaged things. In a story full of severe authority, he behaves like a technician with empathy. That may be why modern readers keep returning to him, even when they disagree about everything else. In some moods, I think the entire Anunnaki cycle can be read as a contest between two styles of order. One style values control, hierarchy, noise reduction, fixed boundaries, and the right to erase whatever becomes inconvenient. The other values adaptation, improvisation, mixed solutions, survival of the flawed, and the preservation of what has already been made. If that is true, then humanity stands where it does because the second style kept winning at crucial moments, though never cleanly and never without cost. That cost is written everywhere in the aftermath. Dust over streets, languages turning scholarly, temples outliving certainty, omen systems blooming from old fear, kings inheriting thrones without inheriting the old confidence attached to them. An adult world, really, one in which authority still exists, but innocence about authority does not. You know that feeling when a family keeps setting one extra place at the table for years after someone is gone, not because they expect a literal return, but because the shape of the household never fully healed around the absence. That is a little how later Mesopotamian religion feels when it remembers the older age. The gods are still invoked, still dressed, still addressed in splendid language. But there is often a faint sense that the best part of the household happened earlier, and that those now serving are maintaining a ceremony whose original immediacy can no longer quite be restored. This is where the literal interpretation, daring as it is, acquires its saddest form. If actual powerful beings once ruled these cities directly and then departed after internal war and catastrophic deployment of terrible capabilities, then all later religion in the region becomes the long etiquette of those left behind. Every rite is a way of keeping the house in case they return. Every omen is a nervous glance at the sky. Every archive is a storage room for disaster preparedness and ancestral correspondence. If that sounds too grand, remember how often human behavior becomes grand when grief is old enough. We make systems from memory because memory alone is too fragile. And that, I think, is what those omen scholars were doing. Not merely being superstitious, but institutionalizing vigilance. Tracking eclipses because previous generations had concluded that sky anomalies and historical trauma belonged somehow in the same file. Whether their causal theory was right matters less, at first, than the fact that they believed repetition was possible. That belief organizes culture. It trains attention. It changes how kings act, how priests advise, how archives are built, how children are educated. The most unsettling possibility of all may not be that the Anunnaki were literal advanced beings. It may be that ancient humanity had already learned something modern civilizations keep forgetting. That complex systems can fail in ways that look supernatural from the inside. They produce conditions so extreme that ordinary language collapses. Fire from heaven, evil wind, silence in the birds, dust where houses stood. These may be mythic phrases. Yes, they may also be the most honest phrases available to witnesses looking at total systems failure and realizing that normal categories no longer fit. That would explain why the archive remains so open. The texts continue to speak because they operate on multiple levels at once. They are old stories. They are memory traps. They are political theology. They are disaster literature. They are theological argument. They are, perhaps, in fragments, records of real things no one now feels professionally safe describing too plainly. I am always wary of certainty in rooms like this. Certainty arrives eager, polished, and underread. The clay deserves slower company. So let us say only what the tablets allow us to say without embarrassment. They allow us to say that Mesopotamian civilization preserved a long memory of divine division. Not only divine order, they allow us to say that humanity was remembered as both solution and problem within that system. They allow us to say that flood, abandonment, and catastrophic city destruction were understood as turning points in the relationship between heaven and earth. They allow us to say that later generations tracked celestial signs with disciplined seriousness because they believed earlier disasters had come in patterns. They allow us to say that something changed profoundly around the end of the Sumerian age, and that this change was remembered not as a minor political transition, but as the ending of a world. That is already a great deal. By now, the fire in our quiet room has sunk lower. Clay and candlelight belong together in my mind, perhaps because both demand patience and both punish carelessness. If you listen closely to this episode's deeper rhythm, it is not actually about proving that gods fought. It is about learning how ancient people stored dread without letting it devour all meaning. They wrote, they copied, they measured, they built omen systems, they turned fear into curriculum. That is one of the most civilized responses to catastrophe I can imagine. And it leaves us standing at the edge of the last movement of the tale. Not the war itself anymore, but the inheritance. What does humanity do with a world after the old rulers fall silent? What does memory become when the beings who generated it are gone, or changed into symbol, or simply too distant to answer? Why do these stories still feel alive in the hands of modern readers? Why does a broken line from a small fragment in a museum drawer still make the air in the room change? We are almost at that last hush now, the place where interpretation becomes less a verdict and more a mirror. Because once the archive has shown you its possibilities, the final question is no longer only what happened then. It becomes what kind of world you think we live in now, and whether we are any better than the old scribes at recognizing the sound a civilization makes when its deepest agreements begin to split. For the moment, though, do not rush there. Let the old lines breathe a little longer. Let the cities remain ruined at a respectful distance. Let the tablets keep their dust. Let the birds circle above empty courtyards where someone once thought the gods would always stay. In the next and final stretch, we will not force the mystery closed. We will simply walk to its threshold, listen to what remains, and leave the night with the same careful honesty the clay has kept for 4,000 years. There is a way old mysteries end that feels truer than solution. They do not close. They settle. A storm settles into silt at the bottom of a canal. A fire settles into blackened brick. A dynasty settles into a line on a prism. A god, or the memory of a god, settles into liturgy, then into scholarship, then into museum climate control, and still somehow keeps a little heat. That is the kind of ending this story asks for. Not a neat answer pinned like an insect under glass, but a final, quiet arrangement of fragments on the table before the lamp goes out. So let us place them there one last time. A researcher in a museum notices a phrase unlike anything else in the archive. When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki. Not war against monsters. Not war against chaos. War within the divine house. Elsewhere, city laments speak of evil winds, poisoned land, abandoned temples, and gods who chose to leave before destruction arrived. Elsewhere still, flood accounts preserve the memory of a council decision so severe that one of its own members works around it to preserve human life. The tablet of destinies changes hands in repeated crises. Each theft a wound in legitimacy. The underworld and the surface test one another's borders. Labor revolts. Authority splits. Human beings are made, multiplied, condemned, saved, punished, ruled, and finally left with a more distant heaven than before. That is the shape of the archive. Not perfect, not complete, but undeniably shaped. If we read it as mythology, then what we have is one of the greatest surviving psychological maps of civilizational collapse ever written. The gods embody institutions, ecological pressures, rival sovereignties, and the internal contradictions of power. Their wars are our wars magnified until their consequences can be felt at the cosmic level. The final war then becomes the Sumerian mind, trying to hold together the unbearable. Why cities fail. Why climates turn cruel. Why rulers lose legitimacy. Why temples go empty. Why the world after catastrophe never quite feels as inhabited as the world before. If we read it as encoded wisdom, then the archive becomes a survival manual, hidden in story. Watch labor conditions. Watch population strain. Watch concentrated authority. Watch the sky. Watch for overreach between realms and offices. Watch what happens when solutions create new crises. Watch how environmental damage lingers after power struggles end. The final war then becomes not only a past event, but a recurring pattern. A lesson preserved because somebody understood that human beings are excellent at repeating the structure of disaster while changing only the costume. If we read it as historical memory of actual beings and actual conflicts, then the material turns colder and stranger. The Anunnaki become long-lived rulers or advanced powers governing early Mesopotamia, fractured by disagreements severe enough to lead to sabotage, territorial confrontation, catastrophic force, and eventual withdrawal. The final war then becomes literal, a civil war among those once treated as gods, leaving human populations to survive poisoned landscapes, abandoned sacred centers, and the sudden burden of self-rule. In that reading, the silence afterward is not theological evolution alone. It is the quiet that follows evacuation. And because the texts themselves refuse to choose neatly among these readings, perhaps wisdom requires us to remain bilingual in interpretation, to let the literal possibility sharpen the symbolic one, to let the symbolic reading prevent the literal one from becoming silly, to let the archives stay alive in ambiguity rather than dead in dogma. I think that is fair to the ancient scribes. They were not writing for people who had our categories. They were writing for descendants who might still need the warning, even if they no longer understood every mechanism behind it. What I keep coming back to, more than the wars themselves, is the withdrawal, because that is the real ending of the story. Not the deployment of terrible force, not even the ruin of cities. It is the moment afterward, when the old direct order does not return. In the earliest layers of Mesopotamian memory, the gods are local in a startling way. They live in precincts. They need service. They travel. They govern. Their authority is proximate and, frankly, a little exhausting. By the later periods, the relationship has changed. The gods still matter, perhaps more than ever, but their presence is mediated through priesthood, omen, prayer, and script. Their rule is no longer the old hand on the shoulder. It is a pressure felt through sign, tradition, and inherited ceremony. Something happened between those two worlds. Maybe the gods became more abstract because cultures matured theologically. Maybe the institutions of direct temple rule gave way to broader imperial systems. Maybe the old stories fossilized from memory into myth. Maybe the beings themselves left. Each answer can explain the cooling. None can erase the emotional truth of it. The later texts often sound like people living after a departure. How long will you hide your face? How long will you remain angry? Why have you withdrawn? These are not the words of a civilization that feels intimately accompanied. They are the words of a civilization learning to live after nearness. That, oddly enough, may be why the human story in this archive becomes so strong by the end. Once the gods withdraw, whether literally or symbolically, the surviving brilliance of Mesopotamia belongs more clearly to people. To scribes, astronomers, judges, canal managers, builders, traders, and mourners. To mothers memorizing prayers, to teachers drilling old signs into inattentive pupils, to kings who can no longer claim to be gods in the old impossible sense, only favored, chosen, watched, or judged. The result is not a lesser civilization. It is a more recognizably human one. There is courage in that transition, even if the texts mourn it. And perhaps that is the quietest revelation of all. The Sumerian and later Mesopotamian record may preserve not just fear of divine conflict, but confidence, reluctant, wounded confidence, that humanity can continue after the sky grows distant. We can inherit fragments. We can rebuild over ash. We can study what terrified our ancestors and make systems from it. We can turn catastrophe into curriculum, omen into archive, sorrow into memory, and memory into continuity. Maybe that is why the story still touches something raw in modern listeners. We live in our own age of systems under pressure. We too worry about environmental change, legitimacy crises, concentrated power, buried knowledge, and whether our own institutions are sturdier than they look. So when the old tablets whisper about evil winds, divine councils splitting, and cities learning the price of internal fracture, the effect is not merely antique curiosity. It is recognition with dust on it. And yet, I do not want to end in alarm. These sleep stories work best when the darkness softens enough to hold. The ancient archive does not only tell us that worlds break, it tells us that memory survives the breaking. The very existence of those tablets proves that trauma did not get the last word. Someone pressed signs into clay. Someone copied them later. Someone stored them. Someone excavated them. Someone translated them. And now, here you are, listening in another century, perhaps half asleep, while the old warnings move quietly through the room like river air. That continuity matters more than certainty. The fragment from Nineveh matters. The Eridu Genesis matters. The Atrahasis epic matters. The King List matters. The laments matter. The omen texts matter. Not because they hand us a final answer, but because together they model a very old form of honesty. They say, our ancestors endured something immense. They tried to name it with the language they had. Their naming mixed observation, fear, reverence, administration, poetry, and theology. We preserved all of it because some future generation might still need to ask what happened and why the earth felt different afterward. If I had to leave you with one image from all of this, it would not be a weapon falling from heaven. It would be a later scribe copying an older lament he did not fully understand and refusing to skip the difficult lines. That is civilization in one gesture. Not mastery, not certainty, but fidelity. The willingness to transmit the hard part as carefully as the glorious part. Maybe that is what the Anunnaki's final war really became in the end. regardless of what it literally was. A hard part transmitted carefully, so the tablets remain in drawers, in vaults, in published transliterations, in museum glass, in the minds of scholars who argue over signs and syntax, in the imaginations of listeners who hear in them either myth, warning, memory, or all three. The weapons are gone, if they ever existed. The kings are dust. The river keeps changing its mind. The cities are broken and rebuilt and broken again. The gods are silent, or distant, or translated into symbols. But the memory remains, not complete enough to satisfy arrogance, only complete enough to humble it. And perhaps that is exactly what old clay is best at, humbling the living. If the Anunnaki were only stories, then the people who told them were profound recorders of collapse. If the Anunnaki were real rulers remembered through sacred language, then humanity has been living in the long afterglow of their disappearance. If the truth lies between, then this archive is what truth often becomes after 4,000 years. Part smoke, part ledger, part prayer, part scar. Listen to how gentle the ending grows when you stop forcing it to confess. The final war passes into silence. The silence passes into copying. The copying passes into inheritance. The inheritance passes into you. You do not have to solve the mystery tonight. The old scribes did not solve it either. They preserved it. That was enough. More than enough, really. Because preservation is how the dead continue speaking without needing to shout. A wedge in clay, a line on a prism, a lament recited in a school long after the city it mourned had become a lesson. A museum fragment 4 inches wide, waiting in storage until some careful eye noticed the line no one else had noticed yet. When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki, the sentence survives. The world built after it survives. You, listening now, survive. And somewhere beyond all our theories, beyond the climate reports and excavation notes and philological arguments, the oldest human instinct is still there. The instinct to keep watch when the sky feels strange, to tell the children what the elders feared, to remember that even after great powers fall silent, the task of tending the house continues. So let the fire go low now. Let the clay cool in its drawer. Let the ruined cities rest under their patient layers of dust. Let the questions remain open, but no longer sharp. You have walked through the archive. You have stood at the edge of flood, counsel, theft, lament, and withdrawal. You have listened to the oldest voices try to tell you what they thought the breaking of a world sounded like. Now the night can take the weight from your hands. The tablets can sleep again. The gods, whether they were rulers, symbols, or wounds given names, can recede into their long distance, and you can drift with the slow river breath of history, carrying only this final, gentle thought that memory outlives terror, and that even the darkest record pressed into clay was made by a hand that wanted someone in the future to endure and understand. Good night.